Until as recently as 200 years ago, Scotland, like the rest of the British Isles, was a country whose population lived mainly on the land. Only 1 person in 10 lived in the towns of the time. Today, the situation is reversed, with about 90% of the Scottish population living in urban areas. The reason for this change and concentration of population in our cities and towns lies with the development of industry from the Industrial Revolution of the late 18th and early 19th centuries to the present day. In the lowlands of Scotland, the estuaries of the Clyde, Forth and Tay penetrate deep into the landmass, providing access for the importation of raw materials and the export of manufactured goods. Here, the natural resources of coal, iron ore and oil-bearing shale provided the power and substance for early industry. This process of change has been particularly strongly marked in the central lowlands of Scotland. Change has affected not only the workplace itself, the colliery, workshop, mill or factory, but also the houses of the workforce, the tenements and terraces, high-rise flats and garden suburbs of the older cities and new towns. The theme of this programme is how change over time has influenced man and the industrial landscapes he created in central Scotland. Andrew Gibb of Glasgow University explains how the early phases of the Industrial Revolution changed the working landscape.
The first phase of the Industrial Revolution was based on textiles and the use of water power, which was crucial to the location of many of the early industrial enterprises. Mill villages such as Deanston and Tayside, Catrin and Strathclyde or New Lanark created the first industrial concentrations. The textile mills brought migrant workers from rural areas into urban centres. A steam engine freed mills from their streamside location, and many steam-powered flax and cotton mills were set up in the towns. Dundee became the centre of linen working in eastern Scotland, with imports of flax from the Baltic. In the west, Glasgow dominated the cotton industry, with raw cotton imported from the United States.
In the absence of a developed road system, the Forth and Clyde, Monkland and Union canals acted as the major carriers of the Industrial Revolution. They brought Scandinavian timber, Lanarkshire coal and American cotton into the hearts of the towns. Wherever they passed through urban areas, they attracted industry. Rural migrants flocked to the towns and cities to work in the growing industries. Their livelihood in the countryside had disappeared under agricultural improvement schemes, and as they flooded into the towns, existing accommodation was overwhelmed. Between 1801 and 1831, the population of Edinburgh rose from 81,000 to 138,000, and that of Glasgow from 83,000 to 202,000. House building had not kept pace, however, with this tide of migrants, and many were forced into small, unhealthy apartments or rat-infested lodging houses. Typhoid, dysentery and cholera decimated the slum dwellers. In the 1830s and 1840s, new technology brought about the development of a different kind of industrial landscape. Coal and black band iron ores from the Scottish coalfields were the raw materials of the next phase of industrial development. Colliery towns and iron and steel towns like Motherwell, Wishaw and Coatbridge sprang up on the coalfields. Beyond the towns, industry reached out to create a landscape of depression and grim monotony. Industrial villages, where men and women worked long hours at tasks of drudgery and back-breaking labour, sprang up on the coalfields. Escape from their harsh industrial lives, even in their scant leisure hours, was impossible. The spoil heaps, polluted air and grim industrial landscape were with them night and day. The iron towns of the coalfields supplied the metal needed by the new centres of heavy engineering. The advancing technology produced ocean-going iron-hulled steamships and iron roads of the railways, which rapidly became the main carriers of industrial Britain. The west of Scotland began to develop an increasingly integrated heavy engineering industry. In this second and greater phase of industrial growth, towns and cities continued to increase in population, both by attracting migrants and through natural increase. Public transport was undeveloped, and so 3- and 4-storey tenements were built to house the industrial workforce as close to their workplace as possible. By 1914, Glasgow's population had risen to over 1 million, with 8 out of 10 people living in a tenement. During the 19th century, the building industry was controlled by the private sector, and working-class housing was built to minimum standards. Tenements were, at first, built without any internal water supply or toilets, the only sanitary provision being an earth privy in the back court, which was emptied once or twice a year. Later, communal toilets were built on the half landings. Andrew Gibb explains the effect of poor quality housing on the health of the population.
Lack of sanitation and squalid living conditions combined to produce appalling death rates. Fresh water supplies helped combat lice-borne typhus, but the thousands of 1- and 2-roomed houses acted as perfect breeding grounds for contagious disease. Measles, whooping cough and diphtheria affected the young in particular, but polluted air wasted the lungs of young and old alike, with bronchitis, tuberculosis and pneumonia killing countless thousands.
Despite the waste of disease, the productive capacity of industrial Scotland reached its peak in the early years of the 20th century with the enormous demands of the Great War. Ships, tanks, guns and shells poured from Scottish shipyards and factories. But this boom was to be short-lived. With the end of the war and the demand for munitions, the Scottish economy, so completely dependent upon heavy industry, ground to a halt. The closure of factories meant closure of the mines which produced their coal and the shipyards which assembled their products. The endless lines of unemployed faced hunger and cold. These privations highlighted starkly their appalling housing conditions, helped only slightly by interwar government housing programmes. The challenge of the Second World War again helped revive Scottish industry, but in the aftermath of this conflict, national government felt compelled to take drastic action. A series of plans were drafted outlining sweeping changes in the industrial central lowlands. Aimed at breaking up the concentrations of traditional heavy industry, these plans envisaged the creation of completely planned new towns. East Kilbride was designated in 1947 the first Scottish new town. Early housing was designed to receive overspill from the overcrowded cities. The spacious layout, access to garden and recreation space, and above all fresh air, brought a new lease of life to slum dwellers. The new towns focused on the development of new light industry, producing goods such as electrical components, clothing and medical supplies. They provided financial incentives for companies to locate in their well-laid-out industrial estates. While the new towns were beginning to provide growth points for new industry, some old industries were also changing in character and location. Coal mining has suffered a huge reduction in manpower and output, with a pattern of pit closures over a long period of time. The map shows that most active coal mining areas today are in the east of central Scotland. Large areas which were formerly mined, for example in Lanarkshire, now show little sign of mining activity, while there are still some areas which have yet to be exploited. The graphs illustrate the decline of coal production and employment in the Scottish coalfields. Scotland in 1982 produced only 6.4% of the UK's coal production, while in 1938 the Scottish coalfields had produced 13.3% of the UK total. Coal production has fallen less dramatically than manpower because of increased mechanisation and concentration of production in the modern pit. A few very large coal mines have replaced the many small mines which existed in the past. Present-day coal reserves tend to lie deeper, and it's more economical to sink one large pit to exploit these reserves. One such pit is Seafield near Kirkcaldy, where the coal seams stretch for many miles under the Firth of Forth. Seafield is one of a number of mines, some connecting underground, which supply coal to Longannet Power Station on the estuary of the River Forth. Coal-fired power stations provide the bulk of Scotland's electricity. For these stations, a site near a coal supply is clearly important. All large modern power stations, with the exception of hydroelectric power stations, also need a coastal location to provide cooling water, irrespective of the type of fuel they burn. The demise of mining has left another legacy in many areas: dereliction. Spoil heaps and flooded areas of subsidence scarred many areas. Rehabilitation schemes have restored many of these areas to use. This is a view of Strathclyde Regional Park, which occupies an area of former dereliction near Motherwell and now provides a wide range of sport and leisure facilities. There have also been changes in towns which were once the scene of heavy industry, as Andrew Gibb explains.
An outstanding example of the move away from traditional industry to more modern developments may be seen in the town of Clydebank. When Clydebuilt was a byword for high quality in shipbuilding, Clydebank led the world, building a wide range of vessels including giant liners such as the Lusitania. Ancillary industries dependent on the shipyards developed nearby, while the massive Singer sewing machine factory employed a workforce of 17,000 at its peak. The decline of shipbuilding and the closure of Singer dealt severe blows to the economy of Clydebank. In 1980, Clydebank was declared an enterprise zone. The regeneration of its industry was to be administered by the Scottish Development Agency, who provided factories, services and substantial financial aid to firms willing to set up in the zone. By the end of 1983, over 1,000 jobs had been created, and revival was well underway on the old Singer site, with 230 firms taking up premises. Regeneration in Clydebank has meant not only new jobs in modern factories, but also modern housing to replace long rows of tenements. There is also a new shopping centre, offering a wide enough range of shops to tempt shoppers from as far away as Bearsden and Drumchapel.
Reconstruction in Clydebank has been an enormous task, but it pales into insignificance compared to Glasgow. During the 1950s and 1960s, under the 1946 Clyde Valley Regional Plan, housing schemes such as Castlemilk, Pollock, Drumchapel and Easterhouse were built. However, these schemes, lacking in services, soon developed reputations worse than those of the inner city. Once the peripheral housing schemes had received a substantial population from the inner city, and numerous factories had moved out or closed down, renewal of the inner city could begin. In 1957, an ambitious programme of 29 comprehensive development areas was outlined. By 1975, over 95,000 tenement houses and thousands of old factories had been demolished. Unfortunately, many long-established communities were also swept away. In 1976, GEAR, the Glasgow Eastern Area Renewal Project, was set up with a new approach to urban planning. From the start, the local inhabitants were consulted and informed about the developments in the area. The GEAR offices provided the locals with an opportunity to air their views and obtain information about the proposed developments. To help regenerate industry and employment in this area, the Scottish Development Agency had, by 1980, built over 70 factory units. The British Steel Corporation also built 77 small workshop units at the former Clyde Iron Works, creating 500 jobs in what is now known as the Towcross Industrial Village. While many tenements had been demolished under CDA schemes, many remained badly in need of rehabilitation. In many cases, only the stone shells of the original buildings were kept, and completely new interiors were provided to give high-quality modern flats. Many more modern council houses, built in the 1930s or even post-Second World War, also required modernisation at the same time. To partially replace the demolished tenements and to provide alternative forms of housing, large numbers of multi-storey flats and low-rise family houses have been built by Glasgow District Council and the Scottish Special Housing Association. Private companies have also built private housing, which has helped to create a more balanced social mix in the area. Environmental improvements have also helped create much more pleasant surroundings in the housing areas. The SDA have been responsible for large-scale industrial relocation, but this is not a new idea. In 1938, the Hillington Industrial Estate was set up on the outskirts of Glasgow to attract light industries to the city and counteract the decline of heavy industry on Clydeside. The changing structure of industry in the central lowlands has been much more drastic in recent years than merely a shift within manufacturing. Indeed, in 1981, manufacturing industry accounted for only 25% of all jobs. The service sector, on the other hand, had grown to claim 63% of all jobs. As employment in services has risen, bank, insurance and corporation headquarters have competed for office space in the central business districts of the major cities. More and more workers have found employment in these high-rise office blocks or in the numerous shops which line our main streets. Glasgow, for example, is more of a commercial centre now than an industrial city. Both manufacturing and service industries have benefited from the discovery and exploitation of oil and gas reserves beneath the North Sea. Nationally, over 80,000 workers are employed in industry directly related to North Sea oil and gas. Many of these live and work in the central lowlands, making platforms, oil rigs, pipes, pumps and so on. Others man support services, such as supply ships and aircraft. The extension of oil exploration to the west coast could herald much-needed industrial regeneration on Clydeside. When the oil is brought ashore, it provides further employment in the petrochemical industry. At Grangemouth on the River Forth, a number of factories surround the main refinery complex, producing a wide range of products such as plastics, man-made fibres and animal feedstuffs. In the last decade, no Scottish industry has grown more rapidly than electronics. Ferranti in Edinburgh and IBM in Greenock are amongst the largest of the many companies now in Scotland. The electronics industry is producing an ever-increasing number of jobs, now far outstripping in importance any of the traditional heavy industries. The importance of central Scotland in a UK context is also illustrated by the fact that it has over 80% of the semiconductor industry. In the 200 years since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in Scotland, the growth of industry has been responsible for sweeping changes in the way of life of the population of the central lowlands. Landscapes have emerged and been swept away, and this change has accelerated towards the present day. In our modern, high-technology society, change is all the more likely, and we must be prepared for the new styles of jobs and the new landscapes they demand and create.
That's the end of today's program. It was written by Richie Cunningham, William Morrison, and Andrew Gibb, and produced by Moira Scott.